It's long been a common refrain of the right that when someone speaks out in support of refugees, they should be asked, well, would you have one live in your house? The question was always stupid. You can support refugees without having a spare room, just like you can be against homelessness without putting someone up in your living room. But putting that to one side, the fact that 120,000 people in Britain have now offered to house Ukrainian refugees means this argument, which was always silly, has now become untenable. In response, the right have shifted the goalposts. This was a conversation on GB News discussing actor Benedict Cumberbatch's offer to take in refugees.
Jim Davison, what do you think about these celebrities who feel a need to politically virtue signal at these events? You had Benedict Cumberbatch on the red carpet saying he hopes to take in a Ukrainian refugee. I would say there's more chance of that happening than his director, Jane Campion, making a film that makes any sense. But what do you make of it when they take over these ceremonies to politically pontificate?
Well, it's what people do. It's their chance to get on the soapbox. Ask him if he'll take in a veteran that's homeless, that's fought in many wars for our country. No, that's not lefty enough.
So before it was, you can't support refugees unless you personally house them. And now it's, you can't support refugees unless you personally house them. And you also personally house veterans.
First of all, the production value of GP News, like, where is the flaw? Where is the flaw? I cannot find it. It just gets worse every time I see a clip from them. It just speaks to this really absurd and just flawed logic that lies at the heart of so much of this conservative approach to things like welfare and migration, which is this flawed idea that, oh, we wish we could help everyone, but we just don't have enough stuff to help people with. We just don't have enough land. We don't have enough resources. The reason that, we have homelessness on the streets is because just not enough people are willing to, share their accommodation, share their homes with homeless people. That's not why we have a homelessness problem. We have a homelessness issue because we have property is essentially in this country viewed as a notch on someone's investment portfolio rather than something that should be used to house people. It's because we have an entirely unaffordable housing crisis. We have a cost of living crisis now. It's because the way that our infrastructure is built, the way that our state orients itself is towards looking at these things, these essential human needs like housing, like food, like all of these things, like even increasingly healthcare, as investment opportunities, as an asset class, rather than as something that should keep us all safe and give us all a basic standard of living. And the same goes for also this flawed idea that there's not enough room to take in displaced people when we know that vast swathes of the land in this country are being used for golf courses. We know that, there is empty housing all over the place. So it's this like false scarcity mentality that just, penetrates a lot of this. And and the fact that they keep moving the goalposts in this way just kind of shows how it's really based on a feeling that they just don't like seeing people help other people. That's basically the core of this politics.
Kind of the core, isn't it? They don't like seeing people help other people. Because, if you're signing up to have a refugee live in your house, that's not virtue signaling. That's, you're doing something very practical there. And this is what I want to talk about in a bit more detail, Dahlia, because 120,000 people have signed up to host a Ukrainian refugee in their home. Unfortunately, the government hasn't quite kept up with this demand to help. They've been incredibly slow at letting people in. But do you think this outpouring of solidarity is something that can be generalized? I mean, you compare this to sort of the Syrian refugee crisis, when I think Britain let in only 20,000 people, and then even then made it, seem like a disaster, and this is a massive burden. Now, Ukrainian refugees have been presented very differently, and all of a sudden there are 120,000 people who want to invite them in their own homes. Do you think that's, because these are white European people, or do you think that it's because of how the media have discussed this? And if the media discussed other crises in a similar way, then we could see a similar outpouring of solidarity?
Well, I think that the way that the media portray groups does sort of structure the way that the general public respond to those people, and that's why the media has so much power. Unfortunately, I don't think we're seeing here a generalizable shift in public opinion towards refugees, because I don't think that the previous narratives that we've spoken about, for example, with Syrian refugees, I don't think that was actually about refugees. It wasn't about, we weren't having a conversation about people who had been displaced, about people who were fleeing for their lives. We were talking about, the conversation that was happening was about Black and brown people. It was about the humanity of Black and brown people, not the humanity of just people who happen to be displaced. And that sort of, it was drawing on an unnatural fear, which is racism, of not of displaced people, but of Black and brown people. And so it was never a genuine or inherent fear of the other. It was never an idea that we didn't have enough resources to help people, or that it was inherently unpopular amongst the public. It was very much, that narrative was rooted very much in, here is a bunch of Black and brown people. These are people that for decades and decades have been demonized and dehumanized relentlessly by political institutions, by the media, who we've been told are bringing all manner of terrible things, from crime to terrorism, etc. That's obviously going to be internalized by the public, and that's not a specific refugee issue. It's a race issue. Race is the missing link as to why the government has been able to shift from seamlessly, apparently, shift from the position that refugees are so dangerous that you can't even allow them into the country, to refugees are so human that you should host them in your home. Obviously, our position is that that latter position should be generalized to all refugees. But because I don't feel like this moment, even though it is incredibly welcome and it's incredibly beautiful to watch, it's not addressing the racial element there, because it still leaves intact the very racial exclusion and demonization that typically takes place for refugees, who are typically from parts of the world that are on the front edge of colonialism, resource extraction, etc. But the question of, like, what do we do therefore? That doesn't mean that we just give up and we just are pessimistic that things are never going to change for other kinds of refugees. What we need to do is make sure that no one forgets this moment, and that we draw strong parallels between how refugees have been received now, between what's possible when you have a refugee crisis and for future refugee crises. But also, we need to lobby for more effective and humane systems for all refugees to be implemented in this moment of public welcoming of refugees, and like public understanding and empathy for what it means to be a refugee. That should be used now to implement long-term systems, long-term processes, so that refugees of the future do not experience the inhospitability, the cruelty, and the often poverty that refugees, particularly of the past decade, in this country have experienced.